Have you ever noticed how someone you love starts asking you to repeat yourself during conversations, or turns the television volume up just a few notches higher than everyone else in the house prefers? In almost every family, these subtle changes are considered a completely normal, harmless part of growing older. We make light-hearted jokes about family members getting hard of hearing, we learn to raise our voices slightly, and we assume it is simply a mechanical issue with the physical structures of the ears. But modern neuroscience reveals a far more serious reality. Hearing changes in later life are rarely just about the ears. Instead, they are often the earliest, most visible indicators of a quiet, progressive change happening deep inside the brain. Because age-related hearing decline occurs gradually, decibel by decibel, the conscious mind rarely registers the slow degradation of its acoustic world. Instead, the brain works behind the scenes, using its advanced pattern recognition networks to stitch together fragments of sound, filling in the blanks to maintain a false sense of normal hearing. This internal patching process hides the underlying damage for years, masking a silent structural retreat. While the ears fail to capture the physical frequencies, the auditory cortex is forced to work overtime, straining to make sense of the incomplete inputs. This means that by the time you or a family member actually notice that you are struggling to hear, the brain has already been under quiet cognitive siege for a long time. People expect cognitive decline to announce itself with dramatic memory lapses like forgotten names, lost keys, or general confusion. But long before those classic symptoms ever appear, the brain often reveals its structural struggles through how it processes sound. According to landmark epidemiological studies conducted by researchers at Johns Hopkins, even mild, untreated hearing loss can double your risk of developing dementia. When that hearing loss progresses to a moderate level, the risk triples. And for those living with severe, unaddressed hearing changes, they are up to 5 times more likely to experience cognitive decline. This is because your ears and your brain do not operate as separate systems. They are part of a single, highly integrated sensory and cognitive network. When the physical signal from the ears weakens, the brain does not simply ignore the missing information. Instead, it must redirect massive amounts of metabolic energy and processing power away from other critical tasks just to decode the garbled sound waves. This constant diversion of neural resources leaves the brain with fewer reserves to handle memory, attention, executive functioning, and abstract thinking. Before we walk through the 5 critical hearing changes you should never ignore, it is vital that you have the right tools to protect your cognitive longevity. If you're serious about understanding how your body changes and taking control of your long-term wellness, subscribe to the Truewell Prime channel right now. We decode the complex clinical science that your doctor might not have the time to explain, translating it into clear, actionable guidelines you can use to defend your health. Join our community of proactive adults dedicated to aging with strength, clarity, and purpose. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a life-changing update. To understand why these 5 signs are so critical, we must first look at the biological mechanisms connecting the ears and the brain. Sound is not actually heard in your ears. It is processed in the temporal lobes of the brain. Within the inner ear, specifically inside the cochlea, there are thousands of microscopic sensory receptors called hair cells. These delicate cells are responsible for converting physical sound vibrations into electrical impulses that travel along the auditory nerve. Over time, due to age, environmental noise exposure, or poor circulation, these hair cells become damaged or die. Unlike skin or bone cells, once auditory hair cells are lost, they never regenerate. When the signals traveling up the auditory nerve become weak, thin, or garbled, the brain is forced into a state of constant compensation. It must work significantly harder to make sense of the incoming data, a clinical phenomenon known as listening effort. Imagine trying to read a poorly printed document in a dark room with a flickering flashlight. You would quickly develop eye strain and fatigue. In the brain, this constant extra effort recruits help from the prefrontal cortex and other cognitive networks that are normally reserved for memory, retrieval, logical reasoning, and attention. This constant diversion of energy gradually exhausts the brain's cognitive reserve. There is a second, even more damaging biological mechanism at play: auditory deprivation. When the hearing centers of the brain stop receiving regular, high-quality inputs, they begin to atrophy from lack of use. Neuroimaging studies show that older adults with untreated hearing loss experience accelerated shrinkage in the temporal lobes, the exact areas of the brain responsible for memory, language, and sensory integration. Essentially, the brain operates on a strict use it or lose it principle. When sensory pathways go quiet, the surrounding gray matter is pruned away, directly leaving the brain more vulnerable to neurodegenerative processes like Alzheimer's disease. As sensory signals diminish, the brain attempts to reorganize its internal connections to compensate for the silent gaps. This cortical reorganization leads the brain to repurpose unused auditory regions to process visual or tactile information instead. While this neuroplasticity sounds beneficial, it actually disrupts the delicate balance of surrounding networks. The loss of specialized auditory processing makes it increasingly difficult to retrieve words quickly, follow multi-step instructions, and maintain split attention. The brain is quite literally starving for sound, and this progressive decay of primary sensory pathways directly links untreated hearing loss to cognitive decline. Pathological examinations suggest a shared vascular vulnerability that links both organs. The inner ear, specifically the stria vascularis, is highly sensitive to circulatory changes because it relies on a dense network of microvascular capillary beds to maintain the electrical endocochlear potential. There is no collateral blood supply in this system. A single main artery feeds the cochlea. When chronic metabolic conditions like arterial stiffening, elevated cholesterol, or insulin resistance damage these microvessels, they restrict the flow of oxygen and nutrients. This microvascular decline occurs in the inner ear and the subcortical white matter of the brain at the same time, making age-related hearing changes a direct clinical marker for hidden cerebrovascular damage. Sleep fragmentation further accelerates this decline by disrupting the glymphatic system, which acts as the brain's waste clearance network. During deep, slow-wave sleep, cerebrospinal fluid flows through the brain tissue, flushing out toxic proteins accumulated during waking hours. However, when hearing loss or constant tinnitus causes sleep disturbances, the brain is prevented from entering these restorative sleep stages. The lack of deep sleep stalls this cleansing cycle, allowing neurotoxic waste products like beta-amyloid and hyperphosphorylated tau to accumulate in the hippocampus and cerebral cortex. Over years, this toxic buildup promotes the formation of the hallmark amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles seen in Alzheimer's disease, creating a direct physiological pathway between ear distress and cognitive decay. The first silent hearing change that predicts brain decline is difficulty understanding speech in background noise. This functional struggle often shows up years before a person has any noticeable trouble hearing in a quiet, one-on-one setting. You might notice that a parent or spouse can converse easily with you in a quiet kitchen, but completely struggles to follow a conversation during a family dinner, a birthday party, or in a busy restaurant. They might lean forward, squint, ask people to repeat themselves, or simply sit quietly and nod along because trying to isolate the sound of a single voice has become physically, mentally exhausting. Many seniors dismiss this struggle, blaming the noisy acoustics of modern restaurants or complaining that younger people mumble. But the reality is that separating speech from background noise is a highly complex cognitive task. It requires the brain to perform auditory scene analysis, sorting through a chaotic sea of sound waves, identifying the target voice, and suppressing all irrelevant background noises. Within the brain, the thalamus acts as a sensory gatekeeper, deciding which sounds to pass to the auditory cortex and which to block. When the incoming signal is weak, the gatekeeper becomes confused, causing sensory overload. This functional struggle is a clear indicator that the brain's processing resources are being pushed to their limits, signaling an early loss of cognitive flexibility. This auditory filtering deficit is directly tied to the superior olivary complex in the brainstem and the medial olivocochlear efferent system. In a healthy ear-brain connection, this efferent pathway sends inhibitory feedback signals back to the outer hair cells of the cochlea, dampening background noise while highlighting target speech. As hearing loss begins, this neural feedback loop degrades. The brain no longer receives a clean, filtered signal. Instead, it receives an unorganized acoustic soup. To compensate, the prefrontal cortex must deploy working memory and top-down cognitive resources to guess the missing parts of words. What feels like an ear problem is actually a massive processing bottleneck in the central nervous system. exhausting cognitive resources that should be used for memory and logic. The second silent warning sign is the persistent need for volume escalation and constant repetition. This is one of the most common everyday behaviors that family members notice, yet it is frequently normalized as a minor inconvenience. You might find that the television or radio is set to a level that visitors find uncomfortably loud, or that the captions are permanently turned on because the words sound muddy. You might also notice that you have to repeat simple instructions or translate what others are saying because the listener missed the key details. This volume creep is a clear sign that the brain is struggling to distinguish specific consonant sounds. In age-related hearing loss, the ability to hear high-frequency sounds, like the consonants SF, T, and TH, is typically the first to go. Vowels, which are lower in frequency, remain audible. This means the person can hear that someone is speaking, but they cannot make out the actual words, describing the sensation as hearing but not understanding. Shouting does not help because it merely amplifies the lower frequency vowel sounds, making the speech louder but no clearer. The constant need to mentally reconstruct sentences from missing consonant clues drains the brain's cognitive energy, leading to profound listening fatigue by the end of the day. This loss of clarity is rooted in the tonotopic organization of the cochlea, where different frequencies are processed in different areas. The base of the cochlea is responsible for high-frequency sounds, while the apex processes low-frequency sounds. Because the high-frequency hair cells at the base are highly susceptible to damage, they are the first to die. When they are lost, the brain struggles with a phenomenon called auditory recruitment, where the dynamic range of hearing is compressed. The threshold of hearing increases, meaning sounds must be louder to be heard, but the threshold of discomfort remains the same. Turning the volume up is an attempt to force the damaged basal hair cells to fire, but it only distorts the low-frequency sounds at the apex, making speech sound louder, but increasingly unintelligible. The third warning sign is the appearance of persistent ringing, buzzing, or hissing in the ears, known clinically as tinnitus. This is not the brief, temporary ringing that occurs after exposure to a loud noise. This is an ongoing, internal sound that is especially prominent in quiet environments or when trying to fall asleep. Many older adults live with this condition for decades, viewing it as an annoying but harmless symptom that has nothing to do with their overall brain health. Tinnitus is actually a phantom sound generated not by the ears but by the brain itself. This is driven by the deafferentation theory of tinnitus. When input is lost due to inner ear damage, the central auditory gain is turned up. In an attempt to find the missing input, the brain's sound processing centers become hyperactive, turning up their internal amplification until a constant internal feedback loop manifests as ringing. This persistent, phantom sound also stimulates emotional networks like the amygdala, keeping the nervous system in a chronic state of fight or flight. This constant distress disrupts sleep, alters emotional regulation, and consumes the valuable cognitive bandwidth needed for concentration and memory storage. This hyperactivity originates primarily in the dorsal cochlear nucleus of the brainstem. When the brain is deprived of external sound inputs, neurons in this region begin to fire spontaneously and in unison. This synchronized neural firing is sent up to the auditory cortex, which interprets it as a physical sound. The distress of this constant sound alters the activity of the default mode network, the brain network active, during self-reflection and quiet thought. Instead of resting, the brain is locked in a state of hypervigilance, depleting its metabolic resources. Over time, this neural hyperactivity spreads to cognitive regions, including the anterior cingulate cortex, making it harder to sustain attention and store new episodic memories. The fourth warning sign is social withdrawal and conversational avoidance. You might notice a loved one who was once outgoing and talkative start declining social invitations, preferring to stay home. During family visits, they might sit on the sidelines, letting others drive the conversation, or quietly retreat to another room. They may also avoid talking on the telephone, preferring text messages or email, because understanding a voice without visual cues like lip reading has become too difficult and stressful. This retreat is a natural defense mechanism against the embarrassment of mishearing or the exhaustion of listening. However, it carries severe consequences for brain health. Under the cognitive reserve hypothesis, active social interaction builds a denser network of synapses that acts as a buffer against brain decay. Engaging in conversations requires the brain to process language, interpret social cues, recall memories, and formulate quick responses. When a person withdraws from these interactions due to hearing difficulties, their brain is deprived of this essential stimulation. This isolation accelerates the loss of cognitive reserve, leading to a much faster rate of mental decline. This isolation-induced cognitive decline has a clear structural representation in the brain. Neuroimaging studies show that when social interactions decrease, there is a measurable reduction in gray matter volume in the prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function and decision-making. The lack of sensory and social stimulation causes the synaptic connections between the auditory cortex and the frontal lobe to weaken, a process called synaptic pruning. As these pathways thin, the brain's processing speed slows down, making it even harder to participate in conversations later on. This creates a dangerous feedback loop where hearing difficulty leads to withdrawal. Withdrawal causes cortical thinning, and cortical thinning makes future communication almost impossible. The fifth warning sign is repeated misunderstandings that lead to safety errors or daily mistakes. This is the stage where hearing changes translate into real-world consequences. It might look like mishearing a doctor's medication instructions, confusing the time of an appointment, or missing safety warnings while driving or walking. Often, spouses and family members mistake these errors for memory lapses, assuming the person is simply forgetting, when the reality is that the brain never recorded the information correctly because it was never heard clearly. If you do not hear a word clearly, your brain cannot encode it into your memory. The mental energy spent trying to decode the sound waves leaves no cognitive resources available to store the information. These repeated misunderstandings are not necessarily failures of the memory system itself. They are failures of the information capture system due to auditory barriers. When these struggles are misattributed to memory alone, the true root cause, hearing loss, goes untreated, allowing the cognitive strain to continue unchecked. This memory failure occurs inside the phonological loop, a component of our working memory responsible for holding verbal information. When a sound signal is degraded, the phonological loop must hold that incomplete fragment for a longer duration, while the prefrontal cortex runs context-matching algorithms to guess the missing words. This process acts like a computer running out of random access memory. Because the phonological loop is completely occupied with decoding, it cannot transfer the information to the hippocampus, which is the brain's gateway to long-term memory. The person does not remember the conversations because, at a synaptic level, the memory was never written, leaving them vulnerable to serious safety risks. The good news is that this connection between hearing and brain health represents a massive opportunity. Because hearing loss is modifiable, taking proactive care of your ears is one of the most effective ways to defend your cognitive longevity. If you or a loved one are experiencing any of these 5 warning signs, the most important action you can take is to schedule a baseline clinical hearing test with an audiologist. During a clinical evaluation, the audiologist will measure your auditory thresholds across various frequencies, plotting the results on an audiogram. A standard test will also evaluate your speech reception threshold and your word recognition score in both quiet and noisy environments. This testing is crucial because it can identify hidden hearing loss, where the hair cells are intact, but the synapses connecting them to the auditory nerve have been destroyed. If the test reveals a mild loss between 26 and 40 decibels, or a moderate loss between 41 and 55 decibels, appropriate clinical intervention will be discussed. Landmark randomized controlled trials, such as the ACHIEVE study published in the Lancet, have demonstrated that for older adults at higher risk for cognitive decline, a structured hearing intervention slows down cognitive decline by 48% over a 3-year period. This is a massive clinical effect, confirming that managing hearing loss is one of the most powerful modifiable actions we can take to protect our brains as we age. Modern hearing devices do not simply act as simple amplifiers. They function as advanced cognitive support systems. They utilize wide dynamic range compression to keep sounds within a comfortable hearing range, directional microphones to target front-facing speech, and digital noise reduction algorithms to suppress background chatter. By delivering a clean, pre-processed signal to the brain, these devices significantly reduce the cognitive load. lowering listening effort and freeing up metabolic energy for memory retention and executive thinking. Restoring this stimulation also slows temporal lobe atrophy. Combine clinical hearing care with other vascular and brain-healthy habits. Stay physically active, manage blood pressure, prioritize slow-wave sleep, and stay socially engaged. Your ears are the direct gateway to your mind, and keeping that gateway clear is a powerful defense for your cognitive longevity.